Sorry.
No.
So listen, you all. It's 11 a.m. sharp. We have a hard stop at 11:59 and 51 seconds. And we've got a great speaker, conversation partner today who is a fabulous academic, scholar, strategic thinker, and writer, and has written a couple really interesting pieces in what's the name of that magazine? I can't recall. Anyway, somewhere he's out there, and he's damn good. And we've really got more than 40 people. So we want to hear from you, Hal. We want to have a bit of a discussion. It's to you, Damir, to introduce our guest speaker and manage and moderate efficiently and effectively in 59 minutes. Damir, I think, is known by everybody. He is the executive editor of the American Interest and a gifted writer and a terrific moderator. So, Hal, welcome. Damir, over to you for introduction and moderating the conversation. And thanks, everybody, for being with us.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. Thanks, Hal, for joining us. Hal Brands, he's at SAIS. You're affiliated with AEI as well, Hal, at this point.
Right.
You know, again, doesn't need much introduction, and since we're so short of time, I just want to say, you know, Jeff's being coy, but Hal, you can take this any direction you want, and we'll run with you and we'll discuss it. Your latest piece in Foreign Affairs magazine with Peter Feaver and Will Inboden in defense of the blob. If you guys have not read it, I warmly recommend you do. You know, everyone knows that this upcoming election is pivotal on so many different fronts. I would also stress, and I think the article makes a very good case, how pivotal it is going to be in foreign policy. I think the interesting thing is, of course, that, you know, if the Trump administration does go down at this point, I think a lot of the ideas and criticisms that have fueled, well, in part at least, the rise of Trumpism have gotten legs in the last 4 years. It's been institutionalized around town. There's a new think tank in town that is very much devoted to criticizing the blob, one would say, and you know, it's a strand of thinking that has taken root. So Hal, take it away. I just want to, again, remind everyone we are recording this conversation. So just keep that in mind. Hal, please, welcome and take it away, and we'll take it from there.
Well, thank you, Damir, and thanks very much to Jeff for suggesting this and having me. It's really, I think, going to be a lot of fun to interact with this group. I find that more and more of my friends and people that I respect seem to be popping up on the American Interest lists of columnists, and I see a few of them hanging out in various corners of the screen right here. So I'm sure this will be a lively discussion. I'm not going to do sort of extensive remarks at the outset. Maybe what I would do is just kind of very briefly summarize and kind of capsule form the pieces that have come out recently that might be of interest for discussion here. And they're related in a sense because they both deal with hinge questions in the foreign policy debate today. And so just proceeding chronologically, the first one is basically an argument against a return to spheres of influence type arrangements in global affairs. And so as the United States has increasingly been confronted by powerful resurgent or rising competitors in Russia and China, there has emerged a strain of thinking to the effect that the best way of guaranteeing peace and stability in the 21st century is to demarcate spheres of influence in global affairs whereby China would essentially dominate the Western Pacific, Russia would dominate some swath of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, and that would create the basis for some sort of détente, or at least some sort of a live and let live arrangement with the United States. And the argument further goes that this is actually in keeping with America's geopolitical traditions because the United States learned to live with spheres of influence during the Cold War, obviously tolerating Soviet hegemony in Eastern Europe for a number of decades. And so the argument I make is that I think that strain of thinking is actually wrong historically and wrong strategically. I think it's wrong historically in the sense that the United States has never been particularly tolerant of authoritarian spheres of influence in important regions like Europe and East Asia. We've fought world wars to prevent the consolidation of such spheres of influence for a variety of reasons that are deeply rooted in our diplomatic tradition. And even during the Cold War, the United States tried a variety of methods, short of outright military confrontation, obviously, to undermine Soviet control of Eastern Europe, some more effective than others. And so if you look at the current strategic situation, the argument is that spheres of influence are both more dangerous than we think, and a return to them is unnecessary. It's unnecessary because the United States and its allies actually have the wherewithal to hold something approximating the current line, the current balance of power in the Western Pacific and in Eastern Europe, given the right strategies and investments. And it's dangerous because what a spheres of influence arrangement presumes is that the great power in question has limited ambitions and that their fundamental interests are compatible with your fundamental interests. That's what's required to demarcate your area from their area. The problem is that historically, that has often proven not to be the case, and it may not be the case today. And so spheres of influence arrangements throughout history have probably been as likely to result in war as they have been to result in a stable peace. And if you look at, say, the US-China situation today, it's pretty clear that what China would define as its minimum sphere of influence in the Western Pacific, which would run out to the first island chain at an absolute minimum, would represent a severe blow to the US alliance system, the US strategic position in the region. And I think a way that the most American leaders are not yet prepared to contemplate. And so what would happen if you were to tolerate, say, a Chinese sphere of influence, even encompassing just Taiwan, is that you would find the rest of your commitments in the region far harder to defend. So for that and other reasons, I argue against this approach to international affairs. The second piece, as Damir mentioned, is called In Defense of the Blob. And it starts from the premise that one of the relatively few things that a bunch of people who hate each other can agree on is that the blob, the foreign policy community, exerts a pernicious influence on American statecraft. You can find that viewpoint expressed, obviously, by President Trump. You can find it expressed by a few veterans of the Obama administration. You can find it expressed by some leading academics who I think are actually quite critical of President Trump on a variety of other issues. And that argument is based on the idea that the blob is a closed cabal that essentially prevents an open marketplace of ideas from forming when it comes to US foreign policy, that the historical performance of the blob, at least since the end of the Cold War, has been quite bad, and that US statecraft would be better if the blob were denuded of its influence. And we argue that all three of these arguments are in fact wrong, that the blob is the foreign policy community is far more open. There's far more debate on important issues than people realize, and that's true if you go back to the end of World War II up to the present. That the performance of US statecraft since the end of the Cold War has actually been fairly good by any reasonable comparison, and certainly compared to the strategy that a number of academic critics of the blob have proposed as an alternative. And that we're actually getting a real-time experiment in what happens when you sort of sideline expertise and push the blob to the margins today, and that the results are not particularly reassuring, as we've seen in the first 3.5 years of the Trump administration. So there are a lot more threads to pull on, obviously, with respect to each of these pieces and each of these arguments. But just as a scene setter, I thought I would say that, and then I'm happy to take the discussion anywhere that people would like to go.
Great, Hal. Again, let me just remind everyone, if you feel like it, you can type in using the chat feature, and I'll call in you there, or there's a hand raising feature as well in the sidebar of this. Hal, let me just sort of start us off very briefly and pull on one of those threads that you just put out there. There's a tension here, I think, and maybe I can get you to expound a little bit on it. I think you're right, and it's true that the U.S. and its allies can hold the balance, especially in the Pacific, and the costs of doing that, at least on as far as just strategically would be quite catastrophic. The interesting thing between what you said there and then the second piece is the one that there's a question of will and vision. Are you optimistic that in fact that can be regenerated first after 4 years? And quite frankly, again, what led to these last 4 years as well? I mean, it's a question of will to a certain extent. So could you maybe talk a little bit about that while our colleagues also then get ready to chime in? Thanks.
Sure. So, I mean, just to kind of pick up on the question about where will this 4 years leave us, I think the answer is both in a decent place and in a terrible place. A decent place in the sense that whatever the flaws of the Trump administration, and they have been many, the Trump administration, to include a number of people not within the White House, but in the supporting departments and agencies, have probably done more to elevate the visibility of the challenge that China poses to the United States than any prior post-Cold War administration did. And that's an incomplete record, but it deserves recognition nonetheless. I think the real challenge is that we have done better at identifying the problem than working toward solutions. And so it's all to the good to identify China as a strategic competitor. It's all to the good to increase funding for the European Deterrence Initiative, which the Trump administration, in cooperation with Congress, did for at least the first couple of years. But if you're simultaneously disrupting economic relationships with your partners and allies, if you're picking fights with your democratic friends as well as your autocratic enemies, if you're simply sort of spending down the reputation for competence and credibility and effectiveness that the United States has generally had in global affairs over the past 70 years, you may be ending up in a worse place. And so my sense is that the situation is probably salvageable. Strategic transitions and transformations tend to take time in the United States. And so if you were to see the end of the Trump administration and the advent of an administration that picked up on the competitive themes of the Trump administration's strategy documents and policies, but ditched a lot of the self-defeating counterproductive stuff, I think you could get to a relatively good place within a few years. Now, the spanner in the works, obviously, is COVID. And so one of the other things I've written about is that I think it's almost certain that COVID is going to take a significant, the deficit spending with which we have properly responded to COVID is going to promote a deficit reckoning over the medium term, probably in kind of the 3 to 5 year time period. And that's almost certainly going to take a bite out of U.S. defense strategy. And you can try to do more with less to a certain amount, but ultimately, as Bernard Brody said, strategy wears a dollar sign. And if you're not willing to pay for a credible forward defense in places like the Western Pacific, you're not going to have it. The big question mark, obviously, is what will COVID do to the defense plans and defense programs of our rivals as well. And so it's entirely possible that Russia, for instance, could be hit harder than the United States is. It's entirely possible that China could be hit quite hard as well, but it's hard to figure out exactly how that translates into the military balance, because authoritarian regimes may have a little bit greater flexibility in terms of distributing pain over the near term. It also leaves unanswered the question of what American allies will do, and I think a lot of those things are up in the air at this point. And so that I don't have a conclusive answer to the question, but I would just note that there's more uncertainty in my own analysis now than there would have been 2 months ago.
Great. Giselle, you're next. Giselle, you got it? Let me try.
Hello.
Oh, there you are. Perfect.
Yeah, okay. Are you hearing me? Sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, good. Sorry. So I want to get Hal to dig a little deeper on the anti-blob movement or moment. In some ways, you could say that even Ben Rhodes was sort of pretending to be a realist when he first uttered the term the blob. And it's certainly the case that there has been, in the academic world, a sort of inextinguishable school of realism, that goes way, way back. The weird thing is that until the Trump administration, those arguments have really been on the losing end of the policy debate. So I guess the question that I have is, you wonder, so you guys stipulate in the Foreign Affairs article that there's a healthy and robust debate, but it's been pretty one-sided for a really long time, which I think raises a legitimate question about how much of a debate really there is. There's been a debate about what ends are appropriate to achieve sort of consensus American foreign policy goals, and complaints about over-militarization and so on and so forth. But the realist moment is swimming against a deep and powerful tide. So, you can take it as a, answer this in a forecast kind of way or a backward-looking kind of way, but it does make you wonder how long-lasting or how serious the realist moment can be.
So, sorry, just to make sure I understand the question, the premise is that the foreign policy debate has been about tactics rather than fundamentals, which leads you to question how serious the realist challenge really is.
The real foreign policy debate, there's been certainly an academic debate where realism has had a toehold of significant proportions, but going back even to George Kennan and Hans Morgenthau, they've been on the short end of the stick when it comes to policy, actual policy.
Right, and I think that's true, and I would certainly, my view is that the foreign policy debate now is more contested at the level of first principles than it has been in quite a long time. And so the argument we make in the article is that there has been a vicious argument over US foreign policy throughout the post-World War II era, including on critically important issues like American military strategy in Korea, what sort of containment we should practice, and so on and so forth during the Cold War and after. But that really, since about the advent of the Eisenhower administration, there has been basic agreement that more American leadership is better than less American leadership, because bad things tend to happen in the absence of such leadership. And I think that's the piece that is increasingly being debated today. And so you see, I think, two distinct but related lines of critique of that consensus. And the first one, which you identified, is the academic critique, right? The academic realist critique, which basically holds that a lot of what America does in the world makes it less safe and less effective. And if the United States were to do less, it would actually get more in terms of security and prosperity and freedom. And you can see that argument most clearly in the offshore balancing or restraint arguments that are made by a number of prominent folks within the academy. The second line of critique is the kind of the Trump narrow nationalism line of critique. And I should put out a disclaimer here, which is that I have argued there are some similarities between the Trump line and the academic realist line, but many academic realists object to that, and so it's worth taking those objections seriously, because they argue that what Trump doing is a perversion of what they have argued for. And so I'll just offer that disclaimer. But
no actual politician is pure.
Right. So the Trump critique is basically that sort of the positive sum vision of international order that the United States has pursued, whereby we can be secure and prosperous and strong by helping like-minded nations become secure and prosperous and strong is wrong, and that we've been getting ripped off for a long, long time. And so you have to fundamentally renegotiate. In the best case, you have to fundamentally renegotiate the bargains at the heart of the international system, and maybe sort of tear down some of the structures altogether. And so what's unique about the current moment is that you have an intersection of sorts between two critiques, right? Which are united in the sense that they both think that the status quo has gone wrong. And what's also unique about the current moment is that you've actually had a political entrepreneur in Trump who has issued a far more fundamental critique of American foreign policy than anybody, any major party candidate, probably going back to Robert Taft, and was not punished for it at the ballot box. And so that's what I think makes me believe that the debate is more live and more real now than it has been in the past.
Yeah, great. Martin Skold, can you you have the floor next.
Thanks, Damir. Thanks very much. Hi, just to introduce myself, Martin Skold, former Intel community, occasional Republican policy advisor. I've worked for Paul Ryan, most recently for Bill Weld. I work for just about anybody except Trump. And I have a PhD in international relations where I did my thesis on great power competition. So I've been writing a fair bit since then. I absolutely agree, by the way, with your argument about spheres of influence, but I wanted to prod you on that a little bit, especially as it comes to the matter of consensus. Because I think the same debate that we're having is actually a debate that in an odd sort of way has started up, and perhaps in the opposite direction in some cases, among our allies. My critique, actually, when it comes to Europe and then the Pacific, maybe more so Europe, although I think you could make a case with Duterte and U.S. forces, the U.S. Visiting Forces Agreement, is that consensus among our allies when it comes to these areas that are kind of the first line of defense for us has been degraded massively in the last 10, 20, but in some ways even 30 years. The idea of a disarmed Europe and the idea of a European Union that would be all but pacifist takes an old problem about European defense spending and then kind of ramps it up, because you see, for example, with Nord Stream, how Europe rendered itself almost ineffective when it came to things like Ukraine, because it had deliberately economically tied itself to Russia. This at the same time that Russia was already making inroads into NATO with things like Viktor Orban, essentially turning Turkey into a fulcrum where they would share defense information, all sorts of bad stuff. And you're starting to see China get involved as well with the Belt and Road in Italy, for example. My question would be, if we want to hold those lines, if we're committed to not backing off from that because they'll just take more and more, how do you frame the debate, or how do you make the case among U.S. allies, not even so much to contribute their share, but just to get behind the idea that the U.S. needs to be protecting them, because the sense of urgency is not even necessarily there. In some ways, the argument's been won in ways that have nothing to do even with defense policy, but been won politically. I wondered what you might think about that.
Yeah, there's a lot here, and I don't think anyone who looks at the sort of European strategic debate feels that it's in the right place with respect to the threat from Russia, and anybody who looks at it would certainly agree that there have been some worrying tendencies with respect to China as well. And then we can talk about Duterte and the Philippines in a second. The one thing I will say is that when we talk about holding the line against Russia and Eastern Europe, we're not talking about massive military investments that are required, right? We're talking about a presence in the most exposed states that is just survivable enough so that the Russians can't, annihilate it or push it aside or establish facts on the ground in such a way that it's extremely difficult for NATO to respond. And how much you think that takes depends on who you read and what you think about that. But we're probably talking a few brigades basically, including a couple of heavy ones, which doesn't represent by any means an exorbitant investment for the richest alliance in the world. And in fairness, we've made some progress toward that over the past 5 years. Insufficient progress, right? But the needle has been moving in the right direction. On the issue of European financial and economic and energy interlinkages with Russia, you know, I share the concern, obviously. The only point I'd make in the opposite direction is that if you had told me in the summer of 2014 that 6 years later, the US and the EU would still have, you know, fairly punishing sanctions in place on Russia as a result of Ukraine, I would have said that's crazy. There's no way that the sanctions will stay in place that long. And so that's one data point that indicates that when it comes to issues of territorial integrity and open military aggression, at least the most powerful members of the transatlantic community, I think probably have more resolve than we sometimes think. Duterte is really interesting, right? Because I think Duterte is both a total outlier and indicative of a deeper problem. He's a total outlier in the fact that the degree of anti-Americanism that he evinces is in no way shared by the vast majority of the population of the Philippines. And if you look at, you know, the polling, do you support the US-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty? You get a yes answer of like 80% in most polls. And so this is kind of like a bum break for the United States and a quirky feature of electoral politics that we went from a Filipino government that was inclined to work very closely with us to balance China from 2010 to 2016 to, you know, sort of the bloody disaster that we have now. But Duterte he's not completely out of the blue. He's indicative of a broader trend in the sense that he reflects declining confidence on the front line that the US actually can help its allies protect themselves, not so much from sort of a full-on Chinese military assault, but from the salami slicing stuff in the South China Sea in particular. And Duterte has been pretty explicit about his concerns on that issue. And so in some ways, this is what it's kind of starts to look like when the balance starts to erode on the edge of the international system. You know, as I've said, I think the situation is still recoverable. I think if you look at Japan, for instance, they're clearly going in the right direction, but there's certainly reasons for concern for all the points that you know.
Terrific. You know, I think that's a really great point, Hal, about the sanctions on Europe. I mean, that's something that in the this whole it's just sort of the whirlwind of the last few years, you forget, and that I think does point to something more profound about Europe and Russia. And then, again, your point on Duterte as a counterpoint to that. Lilia, you've been texting here in the comments. Do you want to chime in a little bit to talk about Russia, Europe, and you mentioned Ukraine and China? I think it's help us maybe pick some of this stuff apart a little bit.
First of all, Hal, great article. Reading it from my Moscow window, you know, I have to admit that we've been waiting for such article to respond to Ellison and variety of guys who are writing on the topic, especially in the foreign affairs. So my congratulations. I would only mention two things. The first thing, you know, looking at what Europeans, French and German authors are writing, hardly they will support in their accommodationist efforts the idea of spheres of interest. Rather, you know, they try to deliberate on Macron's idea of re-energizing. And it will be strange even, you know, thinking about German and German area of interest, correct? But the most interesting is the paradox. All these articles have started to mushroom when Russia, in fact, during the last 2 years has lost ability to establish and to secure areas of interest. And there is understanding within the Kremlin, and even without, you know, within the Kremlin gang, that Russia has no resources, has such asymmetry of potential that Russia cannot keep areas of interest. That's why, for instance, the idea of Eurasia, of big Eurasia, it has been put on the back burner already for 3 years. Russia cannot do anything to secure Belarusia's loyalty within the, you know, Russian galaxy. As for instance, Balkans, where Russian positions were pretty strong. Look at Serbia. Russia has nearly zero economic influence there. Who is filling the gap? China is filling the gap. What about economically, economic Ukraine? It's China that is the leading, trading partner of Ukraine. So, well, it will be interesting to watch, at least Russia, what kind of new mechanism and ways Russia is trying to use when the Kremlin became pretty sure that they cannot secure militarily or economically areas of interest. So idea, for instance, Russia as a spoiler, and the idea of Russia as the state that has the right to interpret the rules of the game. It's a bit different angle, not traditional. So it seems to me Ellison was a bit late with this area of influence song. We have to watch other much more, I would say, much more cynical ways, at least on the part of Kremlin, to keep and to preserve the great power role.
Hal, yeah, I just, again, maybe talk a little bit about, how you see specifically, the United States in the balance in Europe. I think that's really critical on this. You started talking about this a little bit more going forward. What can you give us maybe a hint about that, especially what Lilia just said, I think, with balancing China and Russia?
Right. So I think, first, just to pick up on a point that Lilia made, with which I am in violent agreement, is that in many cases, it's ironic that we would take the position of conceding a sphere of influence to Russia at a time when the Russians seem to be, at least in their near abroad, pursuing a fairly self-defeating strategy in its own right. And so, prior to 2014, Ukraine was a swing state in the competition between the US and the West and Russia. Now Russia has obviously secured control over Crimea and parts of the eastern half of the country, but the western half is essentially irretrievable for Russia at this point. And so conceding sort of primary Russian influence over all of Ukraine would grant the Kremlin quite a victory that it's been unable to achieve thus far. On the question, I'll pick up as a way of, I think, answering Damir's question and also responding to Lilia's comment about China in Europe and how that complicates the US approach. I'm not a sinologist, but my understanding of what China is up to in Europe is less trying to establish itself as the primary external influence in Europe than simply preventing Europe from siding with the United States in any China-United States competition. And the best way to do that from China's perspective is to promote economic dependency, to fragment Europe by picking off relatively weaker, poorer states, particularly in Southern and Eastern Europe, states with particular financial or economic vulnerabilities or needs, and thereby essentially driving wedges both within pan-European institutions like the EU. This is the whole idea of the 16+1, basically, and then between the United States and the part of the transatlantic community that's on the other side of the Atlantic. I think that's the Chinese strategy. It's been provoking some blowback of late. And so you see increasing discomfort over Chinese policies in places like Germany and places like the Czech Republic and places like Sweden. These are countries that I think have essentially, where important actors have come to realize that the Chinese are either pursuing a predatory trade policy or they're trying to use their market power to stifle free speech in democratic societies by determining what can and cannot be said about China's internal governance and its foreign policy. And so you would think that the American strategy in response to this would be to shore up the transatlantic partnership, to strengthen sort of a democratic, unified Europe as a counterweight to Chinese influence. I think what's distressing is that in some ways we see this administration pursuing the opposite policy. And so there was very clearly a deliberate policy of trying to weaken the European Union, a policy of identifying, frankly, more closely with some of Europe's increasingly illiberal rulers than some of the more sort of stalwart democratic allies that we've been traditionally close to. And my concern is that that's simply playing right into China's hands and to Russia's hands as well, as they try to exercise coercive but sort of non-military forms of influence in the region as a way of weakening America's posture.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Okay, I have Casey Michel next. Go ahead, Casey.
Great, thanks, thanks Damir, and thanks Hal for the wonderful piece that you put together pertaining to spheres of influence. I think it was a great corrective to some of the commentary that had been floating around, and as Lilia said, I think it may be a bit overdue even. So thank you for putting that together. Two kind of brief questions, and actually this is just picking up what we were just talking about. One of the surprises of the post-Crimea setting that 6 years now the sanctions have held, especially under the current administration as they have on Russia. One of the other elements of surprise within that is the ongoing expansion of formal membership within NATO. We saw Montenegro's accession a few years ago. We saw North Macedonia's accession just a few months ago. I was wondering if you might touch on how formal security arrangements, in this case NATO, fit within the kind of broader thesis of shoring up or mitigating the potential for a great power competition and return to spheres of influence. And the second question within that is, I know it's only been a few weeks since the piece came out, but I was wondering if you might just touch on some of the responses you've received pertaining to the piece itself, and especially from any voices or polities within some of the geographic areas that are kind of up for contestation within this great power sphere of influence dynamic in Central Asia, the Caucasus, Eastern Russia, or sorry, Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia. Any responses you may have received on your own end?
Sure. On the first piece, you know, it's true that NATO has actually expanded modestly over the past 3 years and change at this point. Although I think, in fairness, we'd probably have to say that expansion was sort of the residue of earlier momentum in a lot of respects. So the Montenegro thing was essentially done by about 2015, 2016, and was just sort of formalized. North Macedonia is obviously an issue that's been hanging for a long, long time, and the critical change there was the resolution of the name dispute. And so I think that, you know, NATO has a critical role to play, obviously, in denying a Russian sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Although I think NATO expansion has probably gone about as far as it's going to go at this point. There hasn't been what we've seen. So the expansion that we've seen over the past 3 years has basically been sort of filling in the blank spots within NATO's existing frontiers, right? It hasn't been actually pushing that frontier further to the east. And that, you know, for better or worse, I think that is unlikely to happen because the Kremlin has pursued this deliberate strategy of creating frozen conflicts in countries that would be, you know, potentially candidate members. Moreover, there's virtually no European enthusiasm for bringing, say, Ukraine into the alliance, even though Ukrainian enthusiasm for that step has increased significantly since 2014. In terms of the response that the pieces have got, I got a few interesting emails from people living in Australia and Taiwan and South Korea, mostly supportive, although the people who don't like what you read, I find they tend to be less likely to email you, although they're not restrained about pointing that out on Twitter. The more interesting response, I think, came to the piece in defense of the blob, which generated some fairly lively commentary on the interwebs, including a number of response pieces over the last couple of weeks. And I think what it illustrates is, I mean, you can argue about who has the better side of the debate, but what it illustrates is that I think there's a significant amount of intensity in this argument over you know, who is responsible for the unrealized ambitions of American foreign policy over the past couple decades, and what is the proper diagnosis going forward. And we've seen this is a place where we definitely do have a much more contested debate today. And so you've seen the Quincy Institute, for instance, emerge within DC as an advocate of a much less blob-centric foreign policy. I don't necessarily agree with that line of argument, obviously, but I welcome the debate, and I think it's healthy to have these arguments. And so we'll see where the debate goes, but it's been relatively sporty, I would say, over the past couple of weeks.
David Kramer, I have you next.
Great. Thanks very much, Hal. Thanks very much for doing this and for your great pieces that you've had recently. Just two quick things. One is about NATO and your point that you don't need a huge military buildup in the zone. I think in part that's because Putin takes Article 5 very seriously. In a way, I think he takes it more seriously perhaps than some NATO allies do. Certainly President Trump's response to Tucker Carlson about Montenegro was a pretty bad blow to the alliance. I think we have recovered from that. But should there be a second term, I do worry about a US withdrawal from NATO, which essentially would open up the way for Russia to do more things under Putin if he wanted to. The other point I wanted to make is I'm wondering whether more should be made about the moral argument against spheres of influence, which is to say, agreeing to such an arrangement consigns countries that don't want to be in a Russian or a Chinese sphere of influence to being under their sway. And it betrays all the notions that we have stood by for decades about standing by the right of countries to aspire to join international organizations that they choose, to live freely, to not be subjected to authoritarian influence. And I just wonder if more should be made about that, and also the argument that who's going to tell, whether it's the Ukrainians or the Georgians or the Taiwanese or you name it, I'm sorry, the United States isn't going to be there for you anymore. You're going to have to learn how to live with your aggressive neighbors. That to me seems to be both not only a moral argument in favor of your piece, but also politically smart, because there are constituencies in the United States that would not go to having places where their ancestors come from sold off and consigned to spheres of influence. Thanks.
I think those are two great points. I'll start with the second one. I would even take it a step further. If you are, say, agreeing to a Chinese sphere of influence in the Western Pacific or Russian sphere of influence in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, you're not simply denying the countries in question the right to choose their geopolitical alignment. You're probably denying them the ability to choose their political system as well. And so, you know, there is no way, as we've seen in Hong Kong over the past year or so, that the Chinese would allow a Taiwan that came under its geopolitical influence to maintain the vibrant democracy that it has established. There is no way that Vladimir Putin or his successor would allow a Ukraine that had been pulled entirely into the Kremlin sphere of influence to make progress towards a somewhat less corrupt democracy. And so it's an issue of political choice as well. And I think the argument is a powerful one. And I think that, you know, we can sometimes slip into euphemism when we're talking about geopolitics. And so if we are in fact advocating a Russian or a Chinese sphere of influence, it's incumbent to be honest about what that entails, right? And what you are actually prescribing with respect to the tens of millions of people who live in some of these countries. On the first point, yes, I think I was on a call the other day where somebody put this better than I could, where they basically said that the difference between one term of Trump and two terms of Trump is not 1x to 2x. It's, you know, 1x to x to some exponential factor, right? And so I think if President Trump is reelected, he will view it as vindication of a number of his policies and preferences. I tend to, and I may be naively optimistic here, I think that a formal withdrawal from NATO would remain unlikely because there would be a political cost to pay for that at home among some of the Republican senators who support the president still needs. What I worry about more is less kind of the formal divorce than the slow transatlantic drift or the transatlantic rot, where people just, you know, we sort of go through the motions associated with NATO, but no one actually believes that Article 5 or the alliance means anything because the political relationships at the top are so toxic. The United States has so consistently talked down its obligations and responsibilities to the alliance. And so you don't actually realize that the thing is a dead letter until the crisis comes. And that's the scenario I worry about.
And I just, to reinforce that point very quickly, I think you're absolutely right. Whether Trump could actually implement a withdrawal or not, his very talk of doing it would have the same effect for all intents and purposes.
Okay, terrific. We are, this is a 15-minute warning. I have 2 more questions ahead. Nicholas Iluzzi and then Michael Mandelbaum. Nick, go ahead. You were first. If you can just sort of keep it tight so we have space for everyone.
Of course, thank you. I would like to actually press you a bit more on the spheres of influence argument and expand your geographic scope. When we talk about these spheres of influence, a lot of times I hear it in a sort of Orwellian sort of thing where we have a Western Oceania, a Russian-dominated Eurasia, a Chinese-dominated East Asia. But in that Orwellian universe, the conflict zone is in Africa. And I think that is a critical point to discuss when we're talking about spheres of influence today, especially in the case of China. And when we talk about China attempting to impose its will on its geographic neighbors, Taiwan especially, how can we rectify American policy and Western policy in general in Africa, where China has been developing massive influence comparatively? And we can see that in their effective boxing out of the Taiwanese in the WHO. So what is it that the West and America can do to prevent such an end around and such power coming from what we wouldn't assume to be a standard sphere of influence?
And Hal, just one other thing just to add there, we haven't mentioned, so let me just throw it in there. You might want to just say a word about the Middle East, because that's a word that hasn't come up. And in a lot of ways, that has been the driving force for a lot of the discontent, I would argue, in sort of the popular discourse on this stuff. So please go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm glad the question came up, because it speaks to an issue that I haven't quite worked out in my own head just yet, which is I think it is certain that China aspires not just to regional, but to global influence and perhaps to global primacy. That said, I haven't worked out in my head exactly what the path is they think that will best get them there. And so I have a piece coming out, I think this week, that argues kind of as a provocation that China actually has two roads to global influence. The first road is the one that we often think of, where you establish dominance in your near abroad, right, on your geopolitical periphery, and then you use that as a springboard to influence in other regions. And the reason we think about that is because it mimics what the United States did, right? We had to establish our primacy within North America and then within the Western Hemisphere before we could effectively exercise influence overseas. But there's also an alternative path, right? And so if you're China and you conclude that it's just too hard to dislodge the United States from the Western Pacific because of its investments there, because of its alliances there, then maybe you try to outflank that position by building economic and diplomatic and political influence in places like the Middle East, in places like Southern and Eastern Europe, in places like Sub-Saharan Africa. And so over time, the broader American geopolitical position just becomes less tenable, and the alliance with South Korea or the Philippines becomes essentially irrelevant. Right? And as I said, we offer this kind of as a provocation, as a way of getting people thinking, but it's worth thinking through, because if China's pursuing the second path, either in addition to or in place of the first path, then it indicates that there are a variety, there are different imperatives for checking that advance than there would be for simply resisting a Chinese sphere of influence in the Western Pacific. And so the geoeconomic components of American power become much more important. The issue of offering alternatives to whether it's African or European reliance on Chinese investment and technological solutions become much more apparent. And in terms of sort of what the policy challenge is, this is kind of one where it's easy to say and hard to do. And so whether you're talking to folks in Munich or you're talking to folks in Sub-Saharan Africa, the answer that you often get is, yes, we realize that there are strings attached to Chinese investment. We realize that there are negative outcomes associated with reliance on Chinese technology, but we have these economic or infrastructure needs, and what do you suggest for filling them? And so I think the challenge for the United States, and it will only work in concert with US Democratic allies, from Japan all the way around, is basically to develop a more robust set of alternatives for countries that are turning to a reliance on China, not because they want to be part of a Chinese sphere of influence, but because the Chinese are offering, even if somewhat in a deceptive way, to meet a need that actually exists. And so when you see, John Bolton giving a speech on Africa where he goes on and on about the evils of Chinese influence, fine, okay, but that, defining the problem only gets you so far if you don't have much to offer in return. And we've seen some constructive steps in this direction, the US Build Act, some of the things that the Japanese and the Australians are doing in particular, but it hasn't quite been knitted together into a free world answer to the Chinese offensive.
Michael Mandelbaum, please. Oh, hold on a sec, Michael. Let me unmute you. Hold on. Michael, can you hear us? Go ahead.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, we can hear you now perfectly.
Good.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, Hal, I enjoyed the piece on the blob. Very well done. Heartening for those of us who are fellow travelers, although I couldn't help but wonder whether putting a vigorous and persuasive defense of the blob into what is the house organ of the blob might undercut its effectiveness. But I don't know how many Trump voters read Foreign Affairs, but maybe some do. Anyway, on the spheres of influence issue, I think David Kramer made an important point, the central point, and it's really the basis for the strength of the American anti-spheres position, which is that the countries in those regions don't want to be part of a Russian or Chinese sphere of influence, which makes it all the more disheartening, as Mr. Skold points out, that they're not really contributing all that much, or at least as much as they could and should, to resisting the efforts to establish spheres of influence. And now, I think you're probably right that it's not all that expensive to check Russia, although you do have to worry about the Cold War West Berlin problem with the Baltic states. But still, I think it matters for the Europeans to kick in, if only for, and maybe primarily for, American domestic opinion. After all, Trump's line is these folks are free riders, and they are free riders, and they've always been free riders, and in some sense they always will be free riders as long as they're not going to get nuclear weapons. But it would make a better show if they would be somewhat less free. And I don't know what can be done to persuade them of this, because the efforts at private persuasion, as you know well, undertaken by American officials have never worked. That's in Europe. In Asia, I think that the problem is somewhat different. On the one hand, I think the Asians are more concerned about the Chinese than the Europeans are about the Russians, and no doubt rightly so. But I think there are two problems there with the Asians doing more, which, and their failure to do more, I think, does blow back to our debate here, which is ultimately what's going to decide things. One is that the Chinese challenge is a maritime one, and nobody else besides the United States and the anti-Chinese coalition has significant maritime forces. They don't have capital ships. I suppose that it might make a difference if these freedom of navigation operations were flotillas, where you have, I don't know, Japanese PT boats or whatever they have. But that is one problem. And the other problem is, and I think it's a more serious one, I believe it's the case that China is now the leading trade partner of every other country in East and Southeast Asia. And so they don't want to run afoul of the Chinese. So their attitude, as far as I can tell, is they say to us, we'll hold your coat. and you go out and take on the Chinese. And we'll be very happy that you do, and we'll remember you in our prayers, but we're certainly not going to say anything. Well, if it's the case, or let me turn this into a question with two propositions, Hal, and ask you to comment. One, that the underperformance of the Europeans and the Asians does affect the American debate and the American willingness to take the initiative. And two, we don't have any instruments to get them to do more.
So I would agree with a large part of that, and I would just say that my own thinking on this has been stimulated in part by Michael's writings, particularly the piece he did. It must have been a couple of years ago on sort of the idea of triple containment of Iran, China, and Russia. One sort of framing point that I think is important, and I'm sure Michael would agree with this. Some degree of free riding is actually the point of American alliances, right? Because we don't want Germany and Japan to go back to having to feel like they fully have to defend themselves, because it either leads to nuclear weapons or it leads to arms races that are destabilizing in key regions. And so the question since 1949 has been how, within a framework that promotes free riding because it's supposed to promote free riding, do you get as much performance out of the Allies as is possible and desirable? And we've never had a particularly good answer to that for precisely the reason that Michael espouses. And in fact, to get the Europeans to do better has often required some pretty blunt tactics, whether that was threatening to get out of Europe altogether if the Europeans didn't, or if the French didn't ratify the EDC in 1954, and they didn't, and we stayed. Or whether it was, some of the debates about offset payments and the Mansfield Amendment in the 1960s and early 1970s. The best thing, I think some of our allies have been getting religion on this issue, and it has less to do with what we say than with what Russia and China do and say. And so the downturn in NATO military spending ended in late 2014, 2015, not because of anything that Bob Gates or Obama said, but because of what Vladimir Putin did. To the extent that the debate has been going in the right direction in a number of Asia-Pacific countries, it's for similar reasons. Let me just make a couple of quick points about why I think the situation in the Asia-Pacific may not be as, I'm not as pessimistic about it as others might be. One, just an important note, the Japanese actually have quite a formidable Navy. They don't call it a Navy because it scares people, but they've got some pretty good capabilities there. The other point I would make is that you can, because it's a maritime theater, you can do a lot without capital ships, right? And so you can do a lot by basically inverting the Chinese A2AD strategy. And so if you're willing to put cheap and plentiful anti-ship missiles and anti-aircraft missiles and coastal mines and things like that in key areas where the Chinese would have to traverse in order to project power, you can get a fair distance. The critical question, as you point out, is economic. And this is where I think we've made the least progress, and we've actually hurt ourselves the most over the past 3 or 4 years. And this was pre-Trump. I mean, TPP was dying before Trump came into office, but by basically doing away with alternatives to reliance on Chinese trade and investment. What I would say is that we're starting to see the debate shift in key countries in some interesting ways. The Japanese are making a concerted push to lessen their economic reliance on China to the point of paying Japanese companies to get out of China. The Australians are starting to have a similar debate. And so I think what you're going to see is more and more discussion of how can essentially the non-Chinese countries in the Asia Pacific do more with each other economically so that they don't have to do quite as much with China. Now, the Chinese will get in the way and they'll use threats and bluster and the club of embargoes, as they're doing with Australia today, to try to dissuade that. But I think those conversations are going to be happening. And I just wish, and I'll sum up here, I just wish that we were playing a more constructive role at the presidential level in promoting that and other tendencies of resistance to Russian and Chinese power today.
Hal, 12 o'clock on the dot. Thank you so much for this. This was a really rich conversation, and it really just feels like it's the beginning of one, because we have several months ahead of us as we chart and look at what's coming down the pike. So, open invite to have you and the rest of everyone who's here come back and discuss this with us again. Jeff, any final words on your end?
Damir, just thanks to you and Hal, great discussion. Everybody who's with us, including Charles Davidson. Hey, thanks. That was wonderful. Superb, Hal. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone.